Welcome to the 24th video on ancient Greece and part 8 of the Peloponnesian War. Now, in the last video, we ended up with the Battle of Mantinea, and of course that ended in a major Spartan victory. And so the Spartans were able to reclaim some of their lost prestige after all of the rebellions going on in the Peloponnesus. And it gave the oligarchic factions around the Peloponnesus further momentum. And so this was a major victory for Sparta in the sense that it saved Tegea. And had Tegea fallen, the Spartans would have been in dire straits, because they would have been surrounded by enemies on all sides inside the Peloponnesus, so that would have been a big problem. Now, after this battle, there was no real further fighting between Sparta and Athens, and there was no declaration of war, so the peace treaty remained in effect, although barely. And so the attention shifted towards Sicily. Now, Sicily is one of the most conquered territories in history. Numerous countries over thousands of years have fought over this territory, because if you control Sicily, you can control the Western Mediterranean in terms of naval operations. Now, the Athenians had sent previous expeditions to Sicily in the previous decade, and so they were quite familiar with the territory. Now, what happened here was a town called Segesta, and you can see that on the map right here, went to war with a city called Selinus. Syracuse, which you can see right here on the map, supported Selinus, and therefore the war began to turn against Segesta. And what does a city do when they're losing a war in ancient times? They turn to a major power. And that power was, of course, Athens. And in 415 BC, they asked Athens for help. Now, Syracuse made it quite clear they wanted Athens to stay out of Sicily, because they believed that was their domain. Segesta, however, was very determined, and they sweetened the offer by offering to pay for the entire cost of the campaign. So how could the Athenians refuse that? And this also served a long-term interest of Athens. They wanted to dominate all of Sicily for themselves, because if they controlled Sicily, they might control the entire Mediterranean, and maybe even threaten the naval dominance of Carthage. And so Athens initially accepts the offer and allocates a fleet of 60 ships for the purpose. But Nicias had other ideas, and he brought the matter up in the assembly. Nicias advises against the entire campaign. He thought it was very dangerous to send the Athenian forces on a marathon mission to Sicily when more powerful enemies loomed near Attica, mainly Boeotia and Sparta. His other main point was that if the Athenians suffered any setback in Sicily, that just might push Sparta back into the war, and that was the last thing that Athens wanted at this point. So essentially, Nicias was diametrically opposed to this mission, and would do everything in his power to prevent it. Now, Nicias also decided to discredit Alcibiades in front of the assembly, and the main reason was that Alcibiades was the main proponent of the Sicilian expedition. And so, in a sense, this represented how different Alcibiades and Nicias were. Nicias was always the cautious general, while Alcibiades pretty much threw caution into the wind, and was always willing to go on more riskier missions like Cleon and Demosthenes. Now, after Nicias was done, Alcibiades got up next to speak in front of the assembly. Alcibiades presented a very different picture of Sicily. He indicated that Sicily was an island deeply divided, and that Athens could convince many of the city-states on Sicily to ally against Syracuse, and so Sicily was just there for the taking. Alcibiades also made another point, that if they didn't come to the aid of Segesta, that would set a bad precedent that Athens was leaving their allies high and dry in their time of need. And the other main point that Alcibiades made was that if Athens was successful in this campaign, that would add yet another major possession to the Athenian Empire. And perhaps, just perhaps, this would allow Athens to continue the war indefinitely, and would probably result in Athens taking control of all of Greece. Now, as I said in the previous video, Alcibiades was a tremendous speaker, and so he possessed a silver tongue, and so the assembly was beginning to take his side in this debate. And so Nicias decided to change tactics, and he uses one of these tricks that modern politicians love to do, mainly scare tactics. And so he tells the assembly that this campaign will be no easy campaign. It will require a vast navy, much more than the original 60 ships that had been allocated. And he also makes the point that Sicily is not as divided as Alcibiades portrays, and that Sicily and Syracuse had vast amounts of wealth to conduct any war. But this tactic would backfire terribly for Nicias, as the assembly actually called his bluff and agreed to increase the size of the expedition. So suddenly, in just a few moments, the entire expedition is doubled in size, and so the risk was even greater to Athens. And perhaps Nicias regretted talking about the wealth of Sicily, because that only increased the appetite of the Athenian assembly. And so greed, which is always a dangerous thing in making military decisions, became the motivating factor in swaying the debate. So in a sense, Nicias unintentionally provided the impetus for the assembly to agree with Alcibiades. Now there were some immediate problems with this campaign. The first issue was that Syracuse in its own right was a very powerful city, and it really was only a few steps below Athens and Sparta in terms of military prowess. Now, if Alcibiades pulls this off, he's a great hero, but if anything went wrong, the Athenian forces would be cut off from their supply base. And then where would that leave the Athenian military? Now, right before the expedition set sail, a bizarre incident happened. Overnight, some statues of Hermes around Athens were vandalized. Now, the enemies of Alcibiades used that event to charge him with the desecration. Now, this was a problem for Alcibiades, because the Athenians, like many Greeks, were very superstitious, and they viewed this incident as a bad omen, because Hermes was not only the messenger of the gods, he was also the god of traveling. So this looked very bad indeed. Now, Alcibiades was probably smart enough to realize this whole trial was a sham from the beginning, and so he demanded an immediate trial, but his opponents refused because they realized it was better to have him out of town before starting any of the proceedings. Because generals at home are always much more powerful. Generals that are in some remote land are much less powerful at home because they cannot defend themselves. And we see that actually with Julius Caesar. When he's off in the Galla campaigns, there's really not too many incidents in Rome. It's only when he decides to come back to Rome that all of the problems start. And so the situation was not resolved when Alcibiades left with the armada to Sicily. And so there's this cloud hanging over the entire campaign. And with that, the armada sailed. Now, the contingent consisted of 5,100 hoplites, 1,300 light troops, only 30 cavalry, 134 triremes, and the latest allies of Athens, Mantinea and Argos, also sent troops. Now, more problems began to surface. Several key cities that promised the Athenian navy supplies changed their minds and refused to allow the Athenians to anchor in their ports. And so that turned out to be a huge problem. The other problem was that Segesta did not have the funds to cover the cost of the war, so they had misled the Athenian assembly. Now, there were 3 generals in charge of the overall campaign and 3 competing strategies. Now, you might ask, why was Nicias sent on this campaign? Because he was, of course, against it. Well, he was requested by the Athenian assembly to go on this mission. Now, he could have refused, but that would have been looked at as cowardly and would have done major damage to his reputation. But the de facto leader of this campaign was undoubtedly Alcibiades. Now, not surprisingly, Nicias had the most conservative strategy. He wanted to arrange a peace treaty between Segesta and Selinus, and then have Segesta fork over some cash for the expedition, and then the navy would sail back to Athens. And so an overall campaign against Syracuse would be avoided because the root cause of the conflict would be solved. Alcibiades wanted to first gain allies in Sicily and then launch an overall attack on Selinus and Syracuse. Lamachus, who was one of the more senior generals, wanted to launch a direct attack on Syracuse. So all 3 of these plans were very different. In order to break the stalemate, Lamachus decided to go ahead and side with Alcibiades, and so it would be his plan that was instituted. Now, historians have debated which strategy might have been best, and many have noted that the strategy that Lamachus put forth might have been the best one, because a surprise attack on Syracuse might have forced a quick surrender and ended the war very quickly, and therefore would not have given Syracuse time to organize its defenses. Now, Syracuse had heard rumors of the Athenian invasion, and so some preparations were made for the Athenians. One plan involved the navy of Syracuse confronting the Athenian navy at sea, but that plan really did not hold up because the navy of Syracuse was in no position to challenge the Athenians at sea. And so Syracuse requested help from its main ally, Sparta. But the Athenians were already near Sicily, and they first stopped at the city of Naxos. Now, Naxos had been a long-term enemy of Syracuse, and so the Athenians were able to anchor in the port of Naxos and resupply some of their ships. Then the Athenians decided to take a run at Catana, but were unable to make any headway because Catana was a major ally of Syracuse, and so the city refused to switch sides. The Athenians then decided to go ahead and send a minor contingent of triremes to the harbor at Syracuse, but all they found was an empty harbor. But seeing the Athenian ships, the people of Syracuse must have realized that their city was indeed at war. Now the Athenians made a second attempt at Catana and finally were able to take the city. This gave the Athenians a critical base to operate out of, which was just to the north of Syracuse. Now at Catana, a lone trireme arrives, with orders that Alcibiades has been recalled back to Athens to stand trial for his apparent desecration of the statues of Hermes. Alcibiades agrees to follow on condition that he be allowed to return in his own trireme. Now, en route back to Athens, Alcibiades learned that this recall had more sinister intentions. He learned that he had already been sentenced to death, and his estates and properties were all seized. And so, with nothing to lose, Alcibiades decided to make a run for it. And where does he seek refuge? In Sparta, of all places. Can you imagine that? The mortal enemy of Athens, of all places. Now, with Alcibiades out of the picture, Nicias becomes the de facto leader of the Sicilian Campaign. And this will change the entire character of the expedition. And we will get to that in the next video. See you guys then.